Hi, good morning for you. Thank you very much for being here this early. Helena
No
is
worries.
with us from Boston, so it is pretty early for her. So our next speaker, as I said, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your family name correctly, Helena. It is Helena.
Deus.
I don't know. Deus,
Deus.
yes. Helena Deus, yeah, sorry. Received her PhD in computational biology, where she focused on knowledge graph-based management systems as enablers for translational medicine. And she's passionate about finding data science and technology solutions that could significantly accelerate innovation in translational medicine, with a particular emphasis in oncology. And she's currently a data science manager at ZS Association, where she leads biomedical semantic solutions. And today she's going to talk about data sciences in support of biomedical research. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Sepinut. All right, so let's share my screen here. Is the screen sharing okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
All right, so even though nowadays I'm much more in the realm of data sciences, I started as a biologist, and in the back of my mind, biology is always present. It has huge implications, not just for healthcare, but also for our ability to maintain sustainability in this planet. We're going to need it for many years to come. So today I thought I would talk to you guys a little bit about some of the still existing challenges in data science for biomedical research, things we could do as data scientists to support biomedical research and biomedical researchers. But before we go there, I want to tell you a story. When I was very young, my sister was diagnosed with leukemia, and her doctors did everything they could to save her life, but unfortunately she was too small, and there was no way that they could do a bone marrow transplant, and so she unfortunately passed away. But of course, as you can imagine, that had a huge impact in my life, in my career choices, and the more I learn about data science, the more I am convinced that we really cannot address healthcare, significant challenges in healthcare without machine learning, without AI. So how are we going to do that? And why is biomedical research, why don't we have a cure for cancer yet? And part of the problem comes from the fact that the way scientific publishing still works, the way scientific communication and scientific discoveries are communicated is still heavily dependent on human beings. So we write papers for others to read. We don't write papers for machines to read. The problem is, as new platforms for publishing become available nowadays, you probably aren't doing your research by reading a paper, by reading journals, physical journals. You're probably reading online PDFs. And the problem with that, of course, it's both the problem and the convenience is that now you've got so many different platforms on which to publish. There's still a lot of peer review, but the scientists are freer than ever to put their scientific achievements out there. And that also creates a lot of noise, as you can imagine. Anybody can say anything on the web, and that's one of its core principles, but it also means there's a lot more noise in terms of how much we can trust the scientific facts that are made available to us. Add that to the fact that even through normal journal publications, and this statistic comes from PubMed, a new medical paper is published every 20 minutes, right? Which means if you put yourselves in the shoes of an oncologist and you want to make sure that you're in the top of your field and that you have the best possible solution to help every single one of your patients, you can't, because there's so many papers, so many things being published every single day that it's practically impossible for you as an oncologist to actually stay on top of your field. So it used to be the case that a single brain could digest the information available, the scientific information available, and come to their own conclusions and make their own decisions about how to treat patients. But we're getting to a place where even committees of individuals, multiple brains working together, aren't able to keep pace with every piece of information that could be potentially relevant for their decision making. And so the way I explain this to doctors who are still often hesitant to start adopting machine learning and AI is I tell them, look, imagine that it's a giant network of brains all connected together, helping you make decisions. It's not replacing your role in healthcare. Machine learning is actually going to augment your role in healthcare. It's going to mean being able to use machine learning. It's going to mean you being able to have access to the most comprehensive information you can get your hands on, instead of just relying on what your interns are able to read on any given day. And that is, in my opinion, the way to talk with some of these domain experts that are really hesitant to trust the outputs of machine learning and AI. All right. So I'm also here to convince you that some of the aspects behind machine learning, in particular NLP and image analysis, are becoming commodities. So for example, you go to archive or you go to nlpprogress.com, and what you'll find is for most of the typical tasks of NLP, or the commonly needed tasks of NLP, like recognizing entities in text, or classifying sentences, or co-reference resolution, parts of speech, there's so much advanced, especially in the last couple of years, since transformers and BERT became available. We're seeing accuracies of 96, 98%. We're seeing really, really good results in general purpose text. So in a way, machine learning is becoming a little bit of a commodity, especially as far as doing extraction of information from articles to really help build that knowledge engine that we need to help to augment the oncologist. What that means, in my point of view, is that increasing the accuracy, let's say, of co-reference resolution from 80 to 82% is not going to have as much impact as using these pre-existing, pre-trained models as tools in our toolbox to actually solve some of the more complicated problems, some of the problems that don't rely on they don't have yet very, very large training sets. So the challenge, and I like how Andrew Nick articulated this a few weeks ago on Twitter. He said, most academic benchmarks hold the data fixed, right? And I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with competitions on Kaggle and thegrandchallenge.org, and there's a bunch of other websites nowadays generating data science competition. I'm sure a lot of you, that's how you learn the data science that you know. And he says, hold the data fixed and let the teams work on the code. Thinking of organizing something where we hold the code fixed and ask the teams to work on the data. Because in fact, in my experience, that's what's lacking. We've got so many awesome algorithms already, so many models, so many techniques of building highly accurate models, but we keep focusing on experimenting with those models on the same data set, whether it's ImageNet or the IMDb sentence classification, or there's a lot of data sets that are made available on Kaggle, and those, it's great that they're there, but it also means those are fixed, those are solved problems. And I'm really much more of an innovator, so I like the idea of going after unsolved problems. But of course, as you know, as always, the bottleneck is Where do I get the data? How do I make sure that my data is ready for me to use while training a machine learning model? We all hate that part, right? We all hate having to do data collection, data cleaning, data normalization, just so that we could use it. But the reality is, the machine learning is a commodity, right? And so if you know how to do machine learning, if you know how to do deep learning, and you clean and you have a clean set of data, then you're going to be the winner of that particular problem. You're not going to obviously wait for somebody else to apply your machine learning on your data, right? So if you own the data, then you're king, right? You're queen, right? You really own the insight that data set has to give you. So with that said, let's turn our focus a little bit into biology and biotechnology. As you saw from COVID and the whole pandemic, the people who got us out of it, or close to out of it, were the biologists, right? Because they understood how the virus worked, and they understood how our body worked, and they built a vaccine that was able to be utilized by our body to fight the virus, right? So I have no doubt that in the next few years, we're going to really see a huge jump in our ability to change the way we work, to change the way we live through biotechnology. And so I found this nice quote online. Our world is built on biology, and once we begin to understand it, it then becomes technology. So much like a few years ago, we were all embedded in the computer revolution, I do think that pretty soon we're all going to be embedded in the biotechnology revolution, and it's going to sneak up on us. So my advice to you is get involved, right? Don't wait to get involved. Get involved now. Not only is it extremely important for our ability to survive on this planet and for our ability to cure disease, but it's also extremely exciting and a fun area to be in once you sort of have an understanding of what it's all about. So let me tell you a little bit about how to think about this problem. Nowadays we know this. We've known this since, very ancient times. Our DNA, our genetic code, has everything it needs in order to create a human being, right? So generally translated, if you think about this as an encoder problem, the genetic code has the information to encode for proteins. The proteins have information to encode for cells, which in turn have information to encode for organisms like ourselves, which in turn have the information to build ecosystems, right? So an ecosystem is not built in isolation. It's actually built by life. Now, the further to the right you go on this scale, the more complexity you're going to find. So there will be all sorts of emergent properties that arise at every one of these levels that are fairly difficult to control when you get to the high complexity level, right? We've got plenty of examples of that where people try to control the ecosystem, but instead created more problems than they solved. Secondly, the closer you are to the genetic code, the more control you have. And I'm sure every single one of you at this point has heard about CRISPR. And CRISPR is nothing but a gene editing tool. You can pick a piece of DNA that you want to just cut and add a new gene, replace the gene with another. So it's literally our ability to control the genetic code. But as you can tell from this diagram, things don't always work as we intend them to work. So simply adding a gene, even if we know what that gene is supposed to do, doesn't guarantee that the cell will behave exactly like we want it to behave by inserting that gene. And therein lies the importance of machine learning. because if you think about it, at the end of the day, these are all inputs and outputs. Your input is the DNA, your output is the behavior you want your cell to have. So what becomes critical in this view is you have to have the ability to know how to exactly change your DNA to get the desired behavior, right? So if you keep your output fixed, you have to find a way to change your input so that you generate that input. You basically need a mapping. So in order to make this more tangible, let me tell you a bit about a story about, it was a human intelligence story, and hopefully it'll help you guys understand how then to take some of these human intelligence stories and go ahead and build the algorithms to automate them. So this little girl is Emily Whitehead. When she was very young, she developed leukemia. Her parents, took her to the doctor. She had her cancer relapsed twice. So the first and second time she was treated with chemotherapy, and her cancer relapsed. By the third time, her parents were getting ready to take her to hospice. She was so sick that she couldn't handle another round of chemo. But her doctors were not ready to give up. And so they found this trial using a very, very new therapy that was called CAR-T, which in essence is application of CRISPR to modify a person's immune system to learn how to detect and destroy cancer cells, which is pretty neat. So they enrolled Emily on the trial, but she had a very, very bad response. She immediately went into a coma, and her doctors were ready to throw in the towel. Now, in parallel, one of her doctors, Carl June, his daughter happened to suffer from juvenile RA, and his daughter was taking this drug called tocilizumab to help with her rheumatoid arthritis. And Carl June knew this, right? He knew that there was a drug approved for young people, and this drug happened to be an IL-6 inhibitor. Now, when they measured Emily's blood levels, when they did blood tests on Emily, they did find out that one of her cytokines, IL-6 is called the cytokine, was expressed 100-fold higher than in normal people, right? So they had a pretty strong hypothesis that this was the cause of her coma. Her immune system had gone berserk. It was just basically attacking her normal tissues. And so Carl June thought, hey, I've got an IL-6 inhibitor here. I know it works for kids. Let's try it. And it did save Emily's life. Right? Not only did she wake up from her coma, but she's been 8 or 9, I think at this point more like 9 or 10 years cancer-free. And this was serendipitous, right? It just happened that Carl June knew that there was a drug that was approved for kids that may help Emily, right? So this is what human intelligence can do. These are insights that human intelligence brilliantly comes up with once in a while in order to make progress in the world. And thanks to this story, nowadays CAR-T are regularly used for leukemia patients. And not only do they kill the cancer cells, but they keep killing the cancer cells so that the cancer doesn't come back. Now, why am I telling you this story? Because simply, if we want to get really, really good at building AI systems that help us solve real-world problems, then we need to understand how human intelligence works in order to build artificial intelligence. So let's talk a little bit about my favorite topic, knowledge graphs, all right? So where does this data for the human intelligence comes from, so that we can then use that same data to build artificial intelligence? Say I ask you a question. Let's pretend I'm Carl June and I'm trying to answer this question. Is there a drug that can be used in combination with this CAR-T therapy that Emily was given to prevent adverse events? So in other words, I don't want to have to wake up Emily from her coma. I want to prevent the coma in the first place. So in order to answer this question, you have to first break it into sub-questions. Like, what is the mechanism of action of CAR-T? How does CAR-T work? What does it do? Secondly, can you measure? What can you measure based on that mechanism of action? What can you measure to forecast any adverse events that the patient might have? Number three, is there a drug that can be used to reduce these adverse events? And you may want to know if this drug is commonly used in combination with the therapy. Right? So based on these 4 questions, you then identify what are the types of data that I need? What are the entities? If this was an NLP problem, what are the entities in text that you're going to be looking for in order to answer each of these sub-questions? And what are the relationships you need to look for between those entities? So for example, they're definitely a therapy. You need information about therapies because that's what CAR-T is. And you need information about their mechanism of action, like the immune response activation. Then you also need to know if there's a database of drugs that inhibit certain proteins. Like in Emily's case, you're looking for a drug that inhibits this IL-6 protein that I told you about. And you want to know if these drugs or if these proteins like IL-6 are responsible for any known adverse events. Now, this data, unfortunately, it's not all neatly organized in a single database. Just for this simple knowledge graph I'm showing you here, you need to go after at least 4 different types of databases. FDA databases that articulate how biology works, databases of therapies like real-world evidence databases where information about real patients is captured, etc. So not super easy, not as easy as downloading 3 gigabytes of data from Kaggle and running a machine learning model on top of it, but doable. Because if you do come up with this, if you do aggregate this data set, then solving the machine learning problem belongs to you. So I spoke about knowledge graphs, and you may be wondering, what are they? Why do I need them? What's the point? And one point I want to make is that, and think about your own education. As you're going through classes and like studying the coursework, you'll realize that every insight you got in your life was not driven by data. It was not by, you didn't get an insight by reading a million papers and coming up with and realizing something, right? It's the intuition that you built. We read papers and we read books and we do experiments to build the intuitions that will generate the insights. So it's not looking at a million examples of cats that a child learns to identify a cat. Is by developing the intuition of what a cat is, of what makes a cat, right? So much so that they only need to see 5 or 6 cats so that they can learn to identify a cat. So intuition, and I don't know how to, I'm not going to try to define what it is, but it can be captured in a knowledge graph, or at least parts of it. Because what a knowledge graph does is it captures relationships between things, whether they're people, events, organizations, cells, genes, proteins, signaling pathways, etc. I mean, think of the web. That's a massive knowledge graph. So that's what a knowledge graph is. It's an attempt to capture that intuition that's missing when we are often trying to train our machine learning models using data alone. So a bit of history behind knowledge graphs, just to get you guys to understand the idea a little better. So it all goes back to Tim Berners-Lee, and if you don't know him, he's the guy that invented the web originally. He invented the HTML standard. And in 2001, he wrote an article explaining that he never meant to create a web of documents. As you know, nowadays, when we go on Google, we get back documents, and documents are not an answer. Documents may be a gateway to the answer, but they're not the answer. And what Tim Berners-Lee's suggestion was, originally, he wanted to build a web of data where you can create a structured query and the system would automatically give you the answer. Not a document to read, not a bunch of documents to go read, but the most trustworthy answer to your question. So a bunch of computer science got inspired by this idea, and they started creating standards. Because in order to transform the current web into the semantic web that Tim Berners-Lee proposed, you actually need to start capturing the data in a standardized form. So in the web documents that we have nowadays, you'd have to identify where are the entities and where are the relationships as an author of the document, so that crawlers can then crawl your page, look for the answer they need based on the user request. Then in 2012, and there's a really nice video about the Google Knowledge Graph that I recommend you guys go look at. But Google came up with their Google Knowledge Graph. They announced it, and everybody was excited. So basically, what they did is they manually created a knowledge graph that nowadays, every time you go to Google, if you do a somewhat standardized query like Paris, for example, you'll see a knowledge card on the right. That's the knowledge graph, the Google Knowledge Graph in action. Of course, the name stuck, right? We used to call it semantic web. Nowadays, we call it knowledge graphs because of Google. But in essence, in industry, knowledge graphs are being widely used, for example, to do master data management. In other words, how do you actually link data across disparate data sources, like the ones I was showing you at the beginning, the FDA data sources and the biological data sources, etc. We're also using knowledge graphs a lot for text mining, because if at the end of the day, a knowledge graph contains the structured knowledge you need to make decisions, then documents contain those tidbits of knowledge. So you can actually use the knowledge graph to help with your entity recognition and your relationship extraction. And finally, what's starting to happen, and we're not yet there, but knowledge graphs give you a way to create explainable AI by letting you do two things. One, link the output to the input. So even if you don't care about figuring out what the neural net is doing and which nodes are being activated, you can still try to find out why is it that the algorithm said it's blue based on the input. So the knowledge graph gives you enough information for you to link the output to the input, therefore creating explainable AI, because now you've got a chain of evidence to follow. But the other thing that I already see people doing is trying to map the active nodes in a trained neural net with nodes in the knowledge graph. And that's a little harder, but it seems to be a very promising space as well for explainable AI. All right, so I'm running short on time, so I'm going to jump, I'm going to just skip this slide and kind of give you a few ideas on how to use, how to solve what AI tasks are there in life sciences still. You know, if I manage to convince you to, you know, focus a little bit of your time and attention in this type of problem, what are the problems that you could focus on? And these are just a few examples, right? But for example, can we harness the energy of the sun more effectively than we do today? As effectively as plants, right? Plants do it all the time. They take in CO2 and produce O2, right? So you've got that added benefit. And not to mention, they are able to produce massive amounts of energy using just the sun. Can we recycle food? Can we produce food and its byproducts in a sustainable and robust way? Or can we identify new drugs or treatments for cancer? So again, I'm just going to try to open up the problem for you. I'm not going to try to solve it for you. That just to give you an idea of how we could do this using machine learning, using those techniques that you're already so familiar with. Now, let's take a plant, right? A plant uses sunlight, uses carbon dioxide, uses water, and outputs oxygen. If you double click on one of the cells in this plant, and then you double click on these little tiny things you'll find inside the cell called chloroplasts, what you see is this complicated chain where light comes in, and then there's some electrons being activated and CO2 being utilized, and then at the end you've got this creation of energy in the format of this thing called ATP, which is basically the life's battery. It's where energy gets stored. So how would you understand this using AI? One way you could experiment with, and I haven't experimented with, but this is just one idea, is if you take your input vector to be the DNA sequence of that cell, right? As I told you, all that information is encoded in the DNA sequence. You can take the amount of luminosity that your plant is exposed to, the amount of water that your plant absorbs, and the amount of CO2 that your plant absorbs. These are all things you can do today with the proper equipment in the proper lab. You can train a decoder model to output these energy units and the O2 that this plant produces, right? Now, your decoder model, and you won't know it until you try to explain it with the knowledge graph, but your decoder model will be learning the biology, because at the end of the day, yes, there will be a neural net that will have some nodes active and some nodes inactive. But at the end of the day, if you're able to predict very accurately what your input vector, how your input vector gets transformed via, linear algebra of deep learning networks into the output vector, basically what the model has learned is biology, how biology works. So instead of the guessing game that biologists have been trying to use to decode biology, this is a much more effective way of actually understanding how biology works with resort to computers. All right, let me just give you this last problem, and because I think for me it's the more interesting one to solve, which is, can we identify new drugs or treatments for cancer? Now, let's say there's a person and they have a melanoma, skin cancer. When you zoom into that skin cancer, what it looks like is this ugly mass that has like blood vessels all over it. And how did this, if you double click on one of these cancer cells, and I'm kind of on the right here showing you the difference between a normal cell and a cancer cell. A normal cell is constantly emitting signals. When it's hungry, it emits a signal into the bloodstream saying, I need oxygen, I need food. Or when it's low on oxygen, is emitting a signal through the bloodstream saying, I need oxygen. And so the immune system, you probably are familiar with the immune system as the system that comes and attacks our pathogens, but it has a much bigger role than that. We know that nowadays it actually plays this role of helping to build blood vessels so that cells that are in locations with low oxygen and low food get more blood vessels, right? Get exposed to more blood vessels, therefore being given more oxygen and more food. Now, another thing you might know is that our cells actually have a mechanism when they're damaged, and damaged cells happen all the time. Every time you get a sunburn, what the redness in your skin means is your cells have died, right? Your cells have been damaged, too much radiation, too much damage to DNA, and they basically have been destroyed by your immune system, right? Your immune system is able to read that signal, I'm sick, come kill me, right? When the cells are damaged. Cancer cells are cells that not only are, even though they are damaged, they do not send that I'm sick signal. Instead, they hide the I'm sick signal and they optimize towards sending the signal, I need more oxygen, I need more food, because they are growing more rapidly than normal cells, they are damaged, and the immune system takes that as a message to build a lot more blood vessels, right? And this is why you end up having, when you look at tumor in medical journals, and I don't recommend you do that because it's gross, but a tumor is typically surrounded by blood vessels. And that's all the work of the immune system, because the immune system is reading the signals. It's trained to recognize need food, need oxygen messages as a message to behave in a way that creates more blood vessels to feed that tumor, right? When in fact, what you really want is for those immune cells to actually recognize that this signal should actually be associated with cancer, not with a need for more blood vessels. So that's what I propose we could experiment with. So if you take as input the DNA sequence of these immune cells, as well as the signals they're hearing, as well as the drug you want to experiment with, and your output is the behavior, right? To destroy or add more blood vessels. Then at the end of the day, what you have is a decoder model that is able to turn that's able to explain how DNA gets turned into this behavior. So in order to find the optimal drug to use to destroy cancer, or to find the optimal way of engineering those immune cells, right, is by trying a bunch of different outputs and observing which ones actually have the behavior that you want when the signals match those that cancer cells tend to release into the environment. All right, so I just want to kind of conclude here with a few things. So one is machine learning is becoming a commodity. And you know this because I'm guessing the majority of you have downloaded pre-trained models and architectures from GitHub and use them in your problems. Second, in the land of messy data, the woman with the clean data is queen, right? And I see this a lot, and I hate when I see this. Just people go ahead and they prepare their beautifully clean data. They put all of the effort in doing the clean data, and then they go and ask the machine learning engineer, typically a guy, to do the analytics for them. It's like, no, that's insane. I mean, it's a commodity. Analyze your own data, because this is your discovery. This is your efforts. Third, there are complex and meaningful problems to solve in the life sciences, as you've seen. It's not like everything is solved. Quite the contrary. I really do think the world needs more data scientists like yourselves. And finally, being a data scientist means that you don't need to be a domain expert to make significant contributions in the domain. And so hoping I could have some examples for you, but I didn't have time to go after them. But there are plenty of situations where data scientists actually solved problems that domain scientists have been trying to solve for decades, and they couldn't do it because they weren't thinking big enough. They weren't leveraging the power of this combined brain that I told you about in the beginning in order to help them make that discovery. And so with that said, I'll close it here, and I'll stop sharing my screen and ask you guys if you have any questions you'd like to ask.
Thank you, Helena. It was a very thought-provoking talk, and it was, I think, a very good ending of the whole event. In a sense, I think there are so many things that we all want to think about, but let's see if there is any question for you. It is the end of the day. Okay, so it seems there is nothing here, but there was something, I mean, there were many things in your talk that I personally would like to think about. This is the field that I'm very interested in. But at some point, it seems for you that if we could discover the things that are in the DNA, we could solve all the medical problems in a sense. If the answer if the question is within the DNA, the answer is also within the DNA. This is something that you feel is correct. So as soon as we discover that, we're going to solve the health issues.
Keep in mind the emergent properties, right? So, and for those who don't know what emergent properties are, think about salt, right? Salt is a very simple molecule, and sodium and chloride, right, together. There's nothing in salt that says it'll become a crystal with a certain format, right? But you know that if you leave salt for long enough, it will crystallize, and the crystals will have a specific shape, right? So that crystal is an emergent property. Biology is full of those, right? So the information in the DNA may not be sufficient to figure out what those emergent properties will be. So you do need to somewhat include the complexity elements that will allow you to encode also for those emergent properties.
Yeah, but if we get to the point that emergent properties are not really random, there's a pattern, there's some mechanism for them to happen that we don't know yet.
That's right.
So, yeah.
But it's not encoded in the single molecule of salt.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, that's
it's
true.
encoded in when you have many molecules of salt together. That's when the crystal forms.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you very much. It seems there is no question, but I think you may contact Helena later if you had any questions. And I'm sure there are so many things that you would like to think about. Thank you very much for being here, especially this early in the morning.
No worries.
I really enjoyed your presentation.